Okay.
Got it.
Okay, we're all set then.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to begin then, and I want to do a little bit of an introduction. Um, First of all, I want to give a little bit of background on this here. This is the second part of a series that Richard did on the explorers, and he had one book out on Columbus, but he also did a lot of research on the other Italian explorers because Columbus did not exist in a vacuum. And I think what Richard did in the second book that he'll be talking about shortly really ties this into the entire technological advancement of the Renaissance. So before we begin, though, I just want to welcome Robert Petroni, who is listening in from Philadelphia, and he's been in the forefront of a lot of the work in Philadelphia to try to bring facts to the whole issue of Columbus. And it's a very frustrating thing because I'm sure he shares with Richard and a lot of us the whole deal with the whole idea of the facts. What do facts have to do with this? So it's very frustrating. But it was also, I just got an article in the San Francisco Chronicle that the San Francisco School Board promises to behave. And many of you may not know that the school board wanted to change the names of 44 people and titles of their school board. And they were confronted by a lawsuit saying, you can't do this. It's against the Brown Act. There was no due deliberation. So a lot of the strategy around Columbus and other schools and issues really are now going into the courts. And so Robert has been involved in that in Philadelphia. But, you know, you still need facts. And that's why we turn to the historians, the academics, the people that are doing the research. And so that's what I really want to focus on is Richard's works. And by saying that, I don't want to say that Richard has a tunnel vision, because he's done many lesson plans, including one that's very fascinating on the Native Americans in the San Francisco Bay Area called the Ohlone people. So, you know, truth is truth. And we just want really to get a message across that you just can't make blanket generalizations. And saying that, I think before I turn it over to Richard, I just want to do a commercial that are in our page that announced this. We have a new slogan, as well as any donations to make these events possible. Go ahead and donate. And if you want to be a member, if you're not a member, there's also a donation button. So without further ado, Richard, I'd like to turn it over to you, and I'm going to mute myself, and then we will have question and answers after. Thank you.
All right. So welcome, everybody. I think I see there in the crowd David McNeil. I believe that's the one I'm thinking it is. He was my professor at San Jose State that helped me with this thesis originally that turned into this book. So I'm pleased to have him tonight, and welcome. All right, so the book is called The New Man and the New World, the Influence of the Renaissance Humanism on the Explorers of the Italian Era of Discovery. And what you see there is a map that's on the cover of the book, and you can see Columbus is in blue, Vespucci green, the Verrazzano in red, and the Cabots, father and son, in brown. And if you take the sum total of all of those little journeys there, that's about 75% of the Atlantic seaboard that was discovered by Italians first. So a lot of people don't realize quite how much of the first generation of explorers is Italian. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't also Portuguese explorers that went east, and some of them also went west. Of course, there were others, Spanish and others, but a lot of the early explorers that led the way for the rest that followed were in fact Italian. All right, next slide, please.
Okay, be right with you.
So I decided to put up the original Italian names because a lot of them got anglicized. So we got Cristoforo Colombo, Amerigo Vespucci, Giovanni Caboto, Sebastiano Cabot, and Giovanni da Verrazzano. So when you put these all together, these are what are collectively called the Italian era of discovery, which goes from about 1492 to about 1528. So we're going to talk about how a generation of Italian explorers introduced the rest of the world to the Americas. Next, please. So Italian explorers led the way for others. Columbus led an entire generation of Italian discoverers who shared his goal of sailing west from Europe to reach Asia. So like I said, about 75% of the Atlantic seaboard was first explored by Italian navigators. And this led the way to others that found things like the Northwest Passage, the Southwest Passage, and other details of the coast and the interior. So Italian explorers such as Colombo and Vespucci trained many other explorers who sailed for Spain and Portugal. So sometimes when you hear about, oh, they were so uneducated and they just didn't know what they were doing, it's like, well, if they were so uneducated, why did they put them in charge of the schools to train other explorers, right? There was a thing called the Spanish House of Trade. It was an academy that supervised and trained all explorers. It was headed by Amerigo Vespucci and later on by Sebastiano Cabot. And then when Britain and France wanted to gain colonies too, they turned to Italian explorers as well. So explorers of other nationalities came in later to fill in the details of the coastlines and to exploit the newly found lands for their own purposes. But without exception, those who first proposed the westward voyages to America were Italians. Next, please. So what made the Italian navigators so good? Well, they had been doing this for a really long time. And we've all heard of Marco Polo going to China, but he also went to Mongolia, India, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. And he published a book, which was a bestseller. And I like the introduction where he says to the princes, read this or have someone read it to you, which tells you a lot of them didn't read it that time. But that book was so influential that everywhere that Christopher Columbus went, he kept a copy under his arm and had it all, marked up and ready to go. Say, when I see this, it's because Marco Polo said it was going to be there. There's also the Zeno brothers that went to the Faroe Islands and possibly even as far as Nova Scotia. There was Ambrogio Contarini that went to Iran and Russia. Vandino and Ugolino Vivaldi explored Africa. Niccolo de Conti went to India and Southeast Asia. Antonio Donoli discovered the Cape Verde Islands. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine went to the Mongol Empire, and Andrea Corsale went to the East Indies. So you can say dappertutto, right? Italians went everywhere. So that when people like Columbus went to the monarchs and made the argument about we should go west, they could do that with authority because Italians had literally gone everywhere you could go except for the Americas up to that point. So people respected their navigational ability. And, things happen for a reason in the places where they happen in history. And Renaissance Italy was the perfect breeding ground for the voyages of discovery. There's no mistake that it happened there. There was the culture of the Renaissance humanism that started out in Florence and other cities in Italy at the time. And it inspired exploration and influenced how the discoverers interpreted what they found. So there was already this mindset of, we are a new generation, we're discovering new things, and anything is possible. And we're inventing new things right and left. So when this one new idea comes along of a new world, that's just one more discovery, and they just put it right in there with everything else that they were coming up with in art and philosophy and architecture and everything else. So humanism encouraged new discoveries and endeavors of every kind. And many old notions were being challenged. Vespucci mentions that. He says, I don't care what the ancients said in their books. I see something that's new here. They said things like, well, there's only 120 languages in the world. I've already spoken more than those with the natives of the New World. I think there's at least 1,000. Of course, there's a lot more. But they were getting used to starting to challenge old ideas in medieval scholasticism. Just because they said so in a university or an old book translated from the classics doesn't necessarily mean it was true. New inventions and philosophies were being introduced every year. and Italy was the center of banking and entrepreneurial finance. So that's very important. You couldn't have done these voyages of discovery without money, and a lot of that money came from Italian banks. They were the leaders of banking at the time period. So it was a natural progression from thinking of themselves as a new age to the idea of a new world. You know, Petrarch said that they felt like they were midgets standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Because of what they had learned from the classics. But they really felt like they were in a new era, a new age. And so that my thesis basically was that there's a connection between the new age of the Renaissance and the new world. All right, next please. Also, Italian merchants were the main go-between for trade between Asia and Europe ever since the Crusades. Italians were kind of the middleman of the trade. They were bringing in things off of the Silk Road from Asia and things that reached the Levant that the Europeans didn't know about before, like roses and sugar and, you know, different citrus fruits and things like that that were new to Europe. All the fabrics and spices and things like that. Italians were among the best sailors in Europe. They pretty much dominated the Mediterranean trade. And most of the European medieval trade fairs featured goods that were transported by Italians. So anytime there was a market anywhere in France or Germany or England, if they said, there's the Italian goods, everybody went running. You know, that was the best stuff. So everyone used the navigational charts and maps made by Italians and trusted them. And Italians had already been everywhere except for the Americas up to that point. So it was just a natural extension to go one more place. And the traditional landward route to Asia was blocked after the fall of the Mongol Empire. So, you know, if they had wanted to go overland the way that Marco Polo and his family had, it wasn't really possible anymore. There wasn't the same currency and the Mongol army guarding the roads and things like that. So it was actually a lot easier to go by sea and avoid all of that. The Europeans were forced to go around the Ottoman Empire and try to go through Egypt and things like that. And that was not so easy to do without a canal. So it was much easier to just try to sail west to go east. Okay, next, please. So this is the guy who was really at the heart of the whole thing. His name was Paulo Toscani, and he's kind of an unsung hero. So I have this thing where he says, "Dear Columbus, go west, young man," which was really true. He calculated that the actual distance between Europe and Asia was much shorter than the ancients had believed, and that a westward passage might be conceivably made. Now, he was in fact wrong about the numbers. He underestimated the circumference of the globe, and Columbus used those numbers and then cheated even a little bit more to try to sell his case to the Spanish monarchs. And that it was actually the biggest objection that they had to backing Columbus was not whether it could be done or not. They thought his numbers were wrong. So, and they were wrong. So, but he was just really overconfident and wanted to make the case that they could get there as easily as possible. So he took the smallest numbers he could find from ancient documents and then even made them smaller. So. But Toscanelli was the start of all of this, and almost all of the key Italian explorers knew him or met him or had read his writings about going west. So this is really where Columbus got the idea. Next, please. So there was the emergence of the idea of a new world. The collective discoveries of Christopher Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, John and Sebastian Cabot, and Giovanni da Verrazzano constitute a distinct Italian era of discovery, which laid the groundwork for all of the other voyages that followed. Italian discoverers deserve a place alongside the well-known humanists in the history of art, literature, philosophy, and government by virtue of their research and accomplishments. So we always hear about, you know, humanist people from the Renaissance, but we don't often hear explorers included in that group. And they were just as smart and just as creative and just as inventive as all the other humanists. The explorers also made original contributions to the fields of science, navigation, and cartography. So beyond just what they found, there was really a whole new cosmology of what is the world? How big is it? Where is everything? And that was all being invented by them. And along the way, they made all kinds of observations about natural history, philosophy, religion. You know, they really made some of the first ethnic writings about ethnography and anthropology and things like that by describing the people, the animals, all different things they saw for the first time. All right, so the new man and the new world. The worldview of the Italian explorers evolved to include the concept of a new world. So this was a gradual progression where Columbus began to expect it, and then other explorers confirmed it, and then by the time you get to Verrazzano, it's definitely, we're in a whole new place here. This is not part of Asia. They had to reevaluate their cosmography and change the maps to reflect their knowledge. So it was an ongoing process where explorers would come back and they would adapt the maps and say there's more things out there. So the terra incognita gets smaller and smaller, and the known world gets more and more identified. So the concept of the New World was equally profound as that as the New Age. So it's appropriate to talk about the New Age of the Renaissance, but there's also a link between that and the New World. So the most important contribution of the Italian explorers was not what they found, but the change in the thinking that took place when they tried to explain what they had found. All right, next, please. So Columbus is kind of a transition man. He's still got one foot in the Middle Ages and one foot in the Renaissance. So when we think of a Renaissance man, we typically think of the first true awareness of man's location in time and space because of his study of geography, history, and natural philosophy. A much more accurate sense of history and where they are in it. You know, they call themselves the modern times, the New Age. A renewed belief in the dignity of man, that's the humanist part of it, and the importance of his actions and abilities instead of exclusive belief in external influences such as fate or divine intervention. Now, that's not to say that they stopped being Christian or anything like that, but it was more, say a medieval person wouldn't put their name on a statue because they didn't want to get any credit for it. But a Renaissance person, would, like Michelangelo, would go ahead and carve his name on the statue in order to say, well, yes, I have this great ability, but God gave me that ability. So if I talk about my abilities and my gifts, I'm just giving more honor to God. So it's a very different outlook than the medieval mindset where you just want to stay anonymous. And the Renaissance explorers were a little bit proud and they like to boast a little bit about what they did, but that's not untypical for a Renaissance man. So there was a new love of learning inspired by the classics, which was followed by a drive to surpass the accomplishment of the ancients. So that's a typical Renaissance pattern where you go back to the classics. All the explorers did that. They all looked through every scrap of evidence they could find in the classics about what might be out there. And that inspired them to go look, but then they also said, we need to update that knowledge. And it's okay to say we know more than the ancients, which would have been unthinkable to medieval scholars. So a disregard for the scholasticism of the Middle Ages and the rigid subject divisions of medieval universities, opting instead for a broadening of knowledge to include new subjects and new research methods. So the university has really exploded with new knowledge there. You take a person like Christopher Columbus, he goes to college and he runs out of things to take. It's like, where do you get a degree in discoverology? You know, there is no such thing. So he has to basically invent an entirely new intellectual endeavor because he's gone beyond what they can teach him. There's also a new sense of individualism, stressing fame, virtue, and civic accomplishment over piety and humility, which inspired him to accomplish great deeds. So, for example, Columbus says, the reason why I went to the Indies is I wanted to raise money for a new crusade. So there's always part of this bigger mission that they feel like they're part of. So Columbus, he has some of these traits, but not all of them. So in some ways, he's a medieval man, and in some ways he's a Renaissance man. Okay, next, please. So Columbus was a great scholar. So despite anything you hear about, oh, he was stupid and he didn't know anything, he was very well learned. He knew many languages. He read everything he could find. He studied every map he could find. He interviewed anybody who had sailed anywhere. He had a university education and even invented new intellectual endeavors when the colleges couldn't teach him anymore. He did extensive research in preparation for the voyages, probably more than anybody. He studied currents and tides and, you know, stories that sailors had told who had been west and everything he could possibly find. He also had many skills, so that fits the Renaissance man. He could draw maps, he could do astronomy, he could do navigation, mathematics, and then he had to learn a lot of new things like how to be a governor or a general or an ethnologist. And we forget sometimes how hard it would be just the simple thing of learning how to talk to the Indians. That was no minor thing. And he had to do that with many, many different languages and new tribes that no one had ever seen before. And do things like sail through a hurricane or coral reefs or things that no one else had ever done before. He didn't just write about his discoveries. He wrote books about religion, philosophy, ethnology, law, history, and natural history. And some people forget about those sometimes, but those books were also written by Columbus. He managed to communicate with people from several different languages that no one ever had heard before. Okay, next, please. And yet he's still medieval in many ways. Christopher Columbus had one foot in the medieval world and one in the modern, says Emilio Taviani, the noted Italian historian. He trusted ancient and medieval books about the transatlantic distance and where he was more than what he saw with his own eyes. That's probably his biggest fault that kind of kept him in the Middle Ages. Even when the evidence contradicted him, he didn't change his theory. You're supposed to, in modern science, if the evidence doesn't fit the theory, you better change the theory, right? He was always trying to change it around, so, squeeze the facts to fit his pre-existing theory, and that's not the way it's supposed to work. He clung to the idea that he had found Asia even when faced with evidence to the contrary. He tried to make the evidence fit the theory instead of changing his worldview. He believed that he was chosen by God to bring Christianity to the natives. He wasn't unique in that thing. All the explorers did that to a certain extent, but that was really a big part of his life mission more than the others. He said he would use the money to fund a new crusade from going to the New World. And he even said he found things like the Garden of Eden in South America. So that's more like what a medieval person would do. Okay, next, please. All right, so really the transition starts to happen with Amerigo Vespucci. He's the first true Renaissance man, and it's kind of natural that he would be from Florence because that's sort of the capital of the Italian Renaissance. He lived in Florence, right there along the Arno. There's a big street for where his house was. I lived in that city for 1 year, so I got to walk those streets. And he rubbed shoulders with many of the famous people of the Italian Renaissance. So he was friends with the Medici, many of the humanist scholars, many of the bankers, things like that. Kind of a fun fact there, that picture is his cousin Simonetta that was painted, in the Primavera, the famous painting there. A lot of people don't realize that's his cousin. So so he was very familiar with all these new ideas popping up in the Renaissance about art and philosophy and banking and trade and all these other things like that. He started out as a trader and then worked his way into becoming an explorer. So he had a humanistic education, and everything he learned about, he wrote back to his scholarly friends in Florence, and that's why his name became better known than Columbus. All right, next, please. All right, so Vespucci, I think, is the actual discoverer of America because he was the one that knew what he found. So he sailed along the coast of South America, and when he found the Amazon River, he realized that such a large volume of water could only come from a continent and not an island. There was a moment where they were dropping down buckets into the water to see whether it was salt or fresh, and they were about 100 miles out to sea, and they still got fresh water from the Amazon River, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is the biggest river we've ever seen. There's no way this could be an island. Islands just don't have rivers that big. And it was sort of an epiphany where he went, aha, this must be a continent, not part of Asia. Must be something new we've never seen before. So he knew there was new land never reported by the ancients or by Marco Polo. And most importantly, he used the new term mundus novus, which is Latin for the new world, instead of what Columbus had said, tierra nueva, which is Spanish for new land. So really, he's thinking of a new world, a new continent, instead of we just found some new land. Next, please. So why are we called America instead of Columbia, right? It all started in a book that was called the Cosmographiae Introductio, and this book came up in it. The fourth part of the earth, which because Amerigo discovered it, we may call Amerige, the land of Amerigo, or so to speak, or America. So he decided that when he wrote this geography book, Waldseemüller said, well, all the other continents end in A, they have girls' names, so we'll just feminize it and make it America instead of Amerigo. So that's why we're called America. So at the time that Waldseemüller was writing his atlas, the word had not come out about Columbus yet because the Spanish were still trying to keep it a secret. They didn't want anybody to steal their colonies. So he had read the letter of Vespucci to his friends in Florence. And so that was the first he had heard. And he said, okay, Vespucci discovered America. Now this has led to a lot of false claims against Vespucci over the years that somehow Vespucci was trying to steal Columbus's glory and he was this awful person and he lied and all this stuff. Vespucci never said any of those things. It's just an accident because somebody else published it first and put his name on the map that we got called America. Vespucci worked for both the Spanish and the Portuguese, and he wrote back to Florence. And of course, Florence was the publishing center of the world. So if you tell somebody in Florence, everyone's going to hear about it. All right, next, please. So were Columbus and Vespucci enemies? That's actually kind of a myth. You hear that a lot. Some people are so anti-Columbus, they want to bash everything he did. And so they go pro-Vespucci, and then some people are the other way around. There's actually no documentary evidence to prove that Vespucci tried to steal Columbus's glory. He said on his maps, this place was found by Columbus and gave him credit for it. So he never tried to say, I was there first. It's just that when the documents got published, they had a date on it that said that he was there before Columbus. That could have easily been some kind of translation error or printer's error or something like that. He never made any public statements saying, I'm the discoverer of America, not Columbus. So this misunderstanding arose because Vespucci's book got published first and people began calling the land America. And like I said, people go back and forth and try to say that one or the other is a fake and that, you know, an usurper, and that never really happened. All right, next, please. So Amerigo is actually a pretty amazing guy. He traveled thousands of miles on his voyages. He discovered most of the South American coastline, and he almost made it to the Pacific. He went very far south along the coast of South America, and he was almost to the Horn, and he had to turn back. They had troubles with their ships. They had some shipworms. The sailors were starting to whine, I want to go home, I'm tired, you know, the water's bad, the weather's bad. And, you know, the waves were getting big and things like that. And he stopped just short of that. So just a few years later, Magellan would overcome the mutineers, you know, and push on, get past the bad weather and break out to the Pacific Ocean. So he almost discovered the Pacific before Magellan. He also had the most accurate prediction of the actual circumference of the globe until modern instruments were invented. He was only off by a few hundred miles, which is pretty amazing for just sitting there and guessing. All right, next, please. And then the next group was the Cabots. They're known in English as John and Sebastian Cabot. That's because they lived in England for a while. They're probably the best father and son team in the history of exploration. They were from Venice, but they lived in England for many years, and that's why their names got anglicized. Some people actually got mixed up and thought that they were the same person, or that Sebastian was trying to steal credit for what his dad did, and that's just not true. They went to England because they had been turned down, because Columbus had only been turned down a few years earlier. So they'd almost said yes to Columbus. So John Cabot thought, well, I'll give it a try. Maybe they'll say yes now that Columbus has been to Hispaniola. So after Columbus's successes, England was eager to get colonies of their own. But they didn't want to go to the obvious places where the Spanish had already been. So they figured they would go further north and hopefully not get caught. So Giovanni Caboto made his case because he used globes skillfully to demonstrate that England was closer to Asia than Spain because the world was not as wide at the top. That kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you turn a globe on its edge, you know, they could show the great circles and say, well, look, it's a lot closer to go to Asia up here at the top than it is down at the equator, down where the Spanish are going. So we can get there first. So both father and son were very skillful at cartography and navigation. And we actually have one of Sebastian's maps that's still in existence, which is kind of cool. All right, next, please. Unfortunately, John Cabot had some bad luck. The Cabots had to steer clear of the Spanish and Portuguese claims in North America. So the Spanish are down here in Florida. The Portuguese are exploring up in Newfoundland, going after the fish in northern Canada. And so they had said, well, we got to go somewhere in between so we don't get caught. So because of the exploration of the Cabots, it's actually where the British claim to North America got started. So there never would have been the British colonies in America if it hadn't been for them. It would have had to been somebody else to find them later. So Cabot is also kind of one foot in the Middle Ages, not as bad as Columbus, but he sailed so close to the time of Columbus that he really said, I'm going to Asia. I mean, he told everybody, I've been to Asia, I'm going to Asia. So he's still thinking of it as, you know, part of the old world. He went there, he just took one ship. He kind of wanted to keep it on the quiet. They didn't want the Spanish to find out, or the Portuguese. He saw some promising things. He brought back some signs of civilization in the New World, and he said, I want to go back. So the king was all excited, and they treated him like a hero. He got a parade when he got back, and he said, give me more ships, give me more men. So they said yes. Unfortunately, though, on the second voyage, he disappeared, and we don't know to this day what happened. One historian that was a contemporary named Polydore Virgil says, this is funny but sad. In the event, he is believed to have found the new lands nowhere but on the very bottom of the ocean, to which he is thought to have descended together with his boat, the victim himself of that self-same ocean, since after that voyage he was never seen again anywhere. So it's kind of sad. We don't know what happened to John Cabot, but the idea didn't die, even though he did. All right, next, please. So his son picks up where he left off. He had lived with his father in England for many years. He decided to return to Canada, but he never did find his father or any survivors or any trace of the expedition. There was a little bit of, somebody said they thought they found a piece of an Italian sword and a few other tantalizing items, but nothing really conclusive to prove what had ever happened to the ship or all the people on it. And it's interesting that at the time that Sebastian is going out, people are still thinking in terms of the wealth of Asia instead of developing America. That was going to come later when they finally realized, okay, we're not going to get to Asia. There is no shortcut, to Asia. We might as well develop what we've got. And then, of course, they found out there's great riches in America. But Cabots are still thinking about, forget this, get past this, and get to China, right, or Japan. So many others followed the Cabots in search of the Northwest Passage. And it's interesting, they used to say back when I was in college, like, why would anybody try that? It's all frozen over. But now with global warming, some of those passages are now opening up again. And people are thinking, maybe that wasn't such a crazy idea anyway. You can actually sail over Canada nowadays. But it's interesting that the British never gave up on that dream. And they were looking for the Northwest Passage as late as the 1800s. There was an expedition where they found everybody frozen, and they still had like their food in their cans from the 1800s. You could open it up and still eat it. So this idea stayed on for centuries of, well, let's just get past this. Let's get over America and get to China or Japan. The British tried that for many generations. And Sebastian Cabot also went as far south as Florida. All right, next, please. He did, unlike his father, he lived a long and productive life. He went to Spain and took over Vespucci's old job of pilot major, training other explorers. He probably at some point met with Columbus and discussed plans with him. We can't prove that, but they did do some business together, so they probably talked about this kind of stuff. And it's interesting that when the heirs of Columbus were sued by people trying to steal their money and their titles, Sebastian Cabot was the only other explorer to come forward and testify on Columbus's behalf and say, no, he was a great explorer. He knew what he was doing. He was a great navigator, and he should not be, lose his titles and money. He tried to go to Venice to fund an expedition of their own, but they said they didn't need any New World colonies. Can you imagine that? There could have been Italian colonies in America, but the in Venice, they were so tied up with trading with the East and the Levant and everything. They said, no, we got plenty of business. We got all the ships we can handle. You guys go do that America thing. We don't think it's going to amount to anything. And it's like, oh no, what a mistake. There could have been Italian colonies there. It's also probably because he was still working for the Spanish, and he didn't want to look like a traitor to them or anything like that. But they did negotiate in secret, but nothing ever came out of it. So Venice was the only Italian state at that time that actually even considered doing their own voyages of exploration, which is pretty remarkable. He also went down on a separate voyage to the Rio de Plata in South America, following up on the lead that maybe there was a way to get to the silver of the Andes easier. There had been legends of a king that was all dressed in silver and things like that. And he spent a long time going upriver and dragging, long canoes and things upriver, and they lost a lot of people, and they only found a few pieces of silver. So it didn't really make him rich or famous, but it did show that there was an interior that could be developed. His Spanish wife died, so he decided to go back to England. And then in his old age, he actually was pretty instrumental in establishing exploration and trade additions to Canada and Russia. So in a way, he did get his father's dream of getting to Asia, because he opened up the Russian trading company that Britain had for many centuries after that, and then the Canadian one, which later became the Great Fur Trading Empire and all of that. So he also was an important cartographer and navigator. And like I said, sometimes people get the father and son mixed up, even though they were definitely different people. All right, next slide, please. And then there's the Verrazzano. I put the bottle of wine there because I actually went to his villa in Florence, and it's pretty cool that you can get the actual wine grown from the same, vineyards there that belong to the family. It's still there, the Castello di Verrazzano. Again, a Florentine humanist, right? He had a lot of background in literature and philosophy and training in cartography and things like that. And he tried to get fellow Florentines to back him up and pay for the voyages of discovery, and they didn't want to do it. So they thought, we got a good thing going with trade with the East, and why mess with that, right? So they really missed a big opportunity there. So he went to the King of France instead. So if you think about it, there could have been all those French colonies in North America could have been Italian as well. So Gatsby. All right, next, please. And some people ask, why is there a bridge named after him? He explored the area around New York, and he's really the only Italian explorer to actually touch what would later become the United States. So maybe we should have a Verrazzano Day instead of a Columbus Day. I don't know. Maybe it'd be less controversial. I don't know. All right, next, please. But in true Renaissance fashion, he changed his mind when faced with the facts. He didn't try to do it the reverse way like Columbus did. It's pretty certain that he talked to Magellan at some point, and he thought that a northern route would get you to Asia faster than a southern route. And then, of course, Magellan died. He was only allowed to explore the gap between the Spanish and English claims in North America, so he had a very limited place he could go between Florida and Canada. But he did realize that he was not in Asia. When he was there, he said, my intention on this voyage was to reach Cathay, which of course is China, and the extreme eastern coast of Asia. But I did not expect to find such an obstacle of new land as I have found. And if for some reason I did expect to find it, I estimated there would be some strait to get through to the Eastern Ocean. This was the opinion of all the ancients and has been proven false by experience. So he says, I dare say, if in a whisper, the ancients were wrong. That's a very Renaissance thing to do. This did lead to some misunderstandings. Some people thought, oh, there still is a secret passage, and map makers continued to draw some inland sea in North America for a long time after that, until it got cleared up. But he tried a southern passage to Asia as well. He tried to go around South America and Africa, but that expedition was actually a disaster. All right, next, please. This guy had a really tough time with the Indians. He went to Maine and he actually got mooned by the Indians, which is pretty funny if you think about it. They're like, get out of here. We don't want anything to do with you. Get lost. True story. He went to the Chesapeake Bay region, and this one is just tragic case of misunderstanding between the cultures. They come forward and they say, welcome to our land, and they extend to him a peace pipe. And he's like, oh my God, it's a weapon, shoot them. So they were trying to make peace, and he accidentally shot them. It's like the worst possible case of cultural misunderstanding there. So funny, but not funny. And then he went on his very last voyage. He was trying to find a passage through Central Americas. They're still trying to get to Asia, right? And he landed, and like many other people, had trouble with the natives. But he actually got eaten by cannibals. So the Italian chronicler that talked about it said his brother watched in horror as he was Adostito e mangiato. Oof, rough way to go. So he died before he could carry out his plans to develop colonies in the New World or find a shorter route to Asia. All right, next please. So in conclusion, Italy laid the groundwork for all the other New World explorers that followed them. The sad part is, though, Italy failed to develop colonies of its own due to its disunity and preoccupation with the Levant trade. So remember, Italy was several different nations at that time. Italy was just a geographical concept, not a united nation. That wouldn't come until the 1800s. And because they couldn't get their act together and they were all rivals with each other, they missed this big opportunity to invest in the New World, and there was never any Italian colonies. So even though they broke ground for everybody else, they never got any colonies out of it for themselves. They thought they had a safe bet in Eastern trade and chose not to get involved in America. What a big mistake. And then sadly enough, other countries used the wealth developed from Italian discoveries to build huge armies and conquer and subdue Italy for centuries. So here we have the Italian age of exploration comes out of the Renaissance, and then the Renaissance is killed when all of their enemies used their wealth from America to build big armies and take over Italy. So it was really a tragic ending for the Italian Renaissance. All right, I think that's the last one. Anything else there?
Okay, do we have any questions? I just have one observation, is that in southern Italy, it actually was a part of Spain.
Yes.
So technically, it was part of the Spanish Empire.
That's correct.
I used to tell people that Spain ruled southern Italy longer than it ruled Mexico, because it was they were part of the Spanish Empire. In fact, Robert from Philadelphia, because he's been in the fray of the battles over trying to deal with just the facts, not to defend or support, but it's very hard to hear because I've gone through city hall meetings and all, and to hear all of the misinformation is so frustrating to anyone that knows a little bit about history. But I think what Richard is doing is really documenting the facts. He's not a defender and he's not an adversary. He's just telling it. And he did this with the explorers too, the Italian explorers. So I think that's about it. Thank you all for participating, and I want to thank everyone that joined in tonight.
Yeah, and you can also pick up the book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or Smashwords. It's on several different websites.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. And
Thank you.
if you have to comment or want to contact me, my email is there and we'll follow through. Bye-bye.